Dawn broke over the shattered hills of eastern France on October 13th, 1944. The fog was so thick that shapes dissolved into ghosts, and the air stank of cordite and wet soil. Somewhere in the haze, a single American outpost clung to a battered ridgeline. A handful of men from the 36th Infantry Division, cold, exhausted, and out of ammunition. At their center stood Captain Samuel L. Hayes, an infantry officer barely 30 years old, his face streaked with mud and sleeplessness. The radio behind him hissed with static. No reinforcements, no artillery, no word from higher command. The battalion had fallen back hours ago. Hayes had been ordered to do the same. But he didn't move. The German artillery came first, methodical, deliberate, like a heartbeat of destruction. Shells arced through the fog, tearing through the remains of the American line. Men ducked into shallow foxholes, clutching rifles that had gone cold in their hands. When the barrage lifted, the sound of boots and metal followed. German infantry, advancing through the smoke. Hayes stood up from behind a shattered log, adjusted his helmet, and called to his men to hold. His voice was steady, measured, unshakable. "Hold your fire until you see them," he said. When the silhouettes finally appeared, gray shapes moving low through the mist, the outpost erupted in gunfire. The crack of M1 Garand's echoed against the trees. Tracers stitched the fog. For a few minutes, the ridge became an island of defiance in a sea of chaos. Hayes moved from position to position, shouting orders, dragging the wounded Tokover, and returning fire himself. His uniform was torn, his rifle jammed twice. Still, he refused to pull back. Hours earlier, the situation had seemed clear. The German counterattack near the Vosges Mountains had broken through 2 American regiments. Communications were in shambles. The 36th Division was retreating toward the main line near Bruyères. The ridgeline, Hill 317, was deemed untenable. The last message Hayes had received over the radio was curt: "Withdraw immediately. Do not hold." But what headquarters didn't see, what Hayes did, was the valley below. Through the shifting fog, he had spotted the telltale glint of German armor, half-tracks and assault guns maneuvering toward the retreating Americans. If the enemy secured Hill 317, they'd have a perfect vantage to shell the withdrawal route. The retreat would become a slaughtered S.O. Hayes ignored the order. He gathered what remained of his company, barely 40 men, and told them the truth. They were staying. No speeches, no bravado, just a cold calculation. If they held this hill for a few more hours, the division might live to fight another day. Most of the men nodded. A few cursed under their breath. None left. By mid-morning, they were surrounded. German mortar teams bracketed the hill, tightening the noose with each shell. Radio lines were cut. Ammunition crates ran dry. One squad, reduced to 6 men, fought with captured MP-40s and scavenged magazines. Hayes crawled through the mud to the top of the ridge, peering through binoculars at the enemy lines. He could see the white smoke of their signal flares, the prelude to another assault. He turned to his radio operator. "Tell the battalion we're still here," he said. The operator hesitated, then spoke into the static. "Able company holding Hill 317 at enemies all around. Will not fall back." There was no reply. As the second attack began, German loudspeakers blared from the fog. A voice in broken English shouted, "Americans, surrender. You are cut off. Throw down your weapons." The men laughed bitterly. Hayes said nothing. He waited until he saw muzzle flashes through the trees, then ordered the machine gun to open up. The Browning roared, mowing down the first wave. Grenades exploded among the rocks. The smell of burned powder filled the air. Every minute they held cost blood. But every minute also delayed the German armor in the valley below. Somewhere behind the lines, American engineers were rigging bridges, artillery units were repositioning, and medics were clearing wounded off the roads. Hayes's stand, unknown to him, was buying them the time they needed. By afternoon, Hill 317 was little more than a scar. The trees were splintered stumps. The ground was cratered like the surface of the moon. Of the original 40 defenders, fewer than 20 were still fighting. Hayes moved between foxholes, handing out what little ammunition remained. He found a wounded private clutching his rifle with both hands. "Sir," the man whispered, "they'll kill us all." Hayes paused. He could see the terror in the young soldier's eyes. "Then we'll make them work for it." he said. The final German push came at dusk. Stormtroopers with flamethrowers advanced up the slope, their shadows stretching across the smoke. The Americans opened up with everything they had left. Bullets snapped through the air. Flames licked the trunks of burned pines. One flamethrower burst under fire, engulfing its operator in a pillar of fire. The ridge turned into a furnace. When the shooting stopped, the silence was almost unbearable. Only the wind remained, whispering through the broken trees. Hayes looked over the ridge. German troops were falling back again, dragging their wounded with them. Somehow, impossibly, the line still held. He sank to his knees, his uniform scorched, his face streaked with soot. He didn't know that reinforcements were already moving up from the rear. He didn't know that the ridge had become a symbol in the divisional reports, a point of extraordinary resistance. He only knew that his men had obeyed his order and that they were still alive. When night fell, the fog thickened once more. The hill was quiet except for the occasional crack of a distant rifle. Hayes lit a single cigarette and stared out into the darkness. Somewhere beyond that black horizon, the rest of the army was regrouping, rebuilding, surviving, because he had chosen to disobey at in war. Sometimes the line between courage and mutiny is measured in minutes. Hayes had crossed it without hesitation, but the question remained: what gave him that certainty? What unseen factor made one man stand when others ran? The answer would not lie in the orders or the terrain. It would lie deeper, in a forgotten piece of training, a unique weapon system, and a hidden advantage the enemy never saw coming. The story of Captain Hayes's defiance on Hill 317 was not just a tale of courage. It was a product of something larger, something engineered long before the battle began. Months earlier, deep inside a converted locomotive factory in Cleveland, engineers had been perfecting a device no bigger than a lunchbox. It wasn't a rifle or a shell, but a radio, the SCR-300 walkie-talkie, weighing 35 pounds, built with ruggedized vacuum tubes, and powered by a 90-volt dry battery. It allowed frontline troops to speak directly with command posts miles away. It was the first truly mobile FM field radio in history. Designed by Motorola's Daniel E. Noble and built under the supervision of engineering teams who worked around the clock to meet the Army's impossible deadlines. This device, introduced in 1943, would quietly rewrite how American infantry fought. Before the SCR-300, battlefield communication had been a fragile web of wires and runners. Radios were unreliable, their AM signals distorted by terrain and weather. Orders could vanish into static. But this new FM technology filtered out noise and held clarity across hills, forests, and even under artillery fire. To the Germans, whose infantry still relied largely on wired telephones and bulky backpack sets, the Americans seemed to move with uncanny precision, shifting artillery fire, calling in air support, and coordinating armor, all in real time. Signal Corps Technical Bulletin, 1944. Hayes's decision to stay and hold Hill 317 was rooted in that invisible network. Hours before the retreat order, his company had been the last link in a chain of FM transmissions threading across the valley. Through his SCR-300, Hayes had been monitoring the scattered voices of neighboring units. Fragments of chaos from the retreat, platoons calling for medics, tank crews begging for fuel, and artillery observers tracking enemy armor through fog. He knew exactly where the line was collapsing, where the Germans were massing, and, most critically, where the road to Bruyères remained open. His stand wasn't madness. It was information. By 1944, the Allies had fielded over 50,000 of these portable radios across Europe. Each was hand-assembled in American factories where women, many fresh from farm towns and high schools, worked 12-hour shifts soldering circuits and testing transceivers. They nicknamed the sets walkie-talkies or packs of steel. Few realized how vital they were until men like Hayes used them to rewrite the battlefield. Motorola Factory Log, 1944. The Germans, encountering this strange American efficiency, were baffled. Reports from captured officers complained that enemy units seemed to react instantly to any movement, and our artillery concentrations are met with immediate counterfire. Wehrmacht Field Report, 1944. They suspected hidden wire networks or coded scouts behind the lines. The truth was far simpler. a radio network that turned scattered infantry into a single, living organism. 2 days after the stand on Hill 317, the 36th Infantry Division launched a counterattack to retake the valley. The plan relied entirely on coordination between ground units and P-47 Thunderbolts orbiting overhead. The FM radios allowed forward air controllers, men with handheld SCR-536 sets, to call in strikes directly on German armor positions. From their hilltop redoubt, Hayes's survivors relayed coordinates for the first strafing run. Within minutes, the roar of engines filled the sky. Rockets slammed into the tree line, shredding the German counterattack before it could form. U.S. Army Air Force's Tactical Report, October 1944. That moment, air and ground acting as one, marked a turning point in the European campaign. The doctrine of combined arms had existed on paper for years, but in practice, it was communication that made it real. For the first time, a company commander could summon artillery, air power, or reinforcements within seconds. Hayes and his men had become part of a new kind of warfare. Decentralized, reactive, and fast to the men fighting. This shift was almost supernatural. One sergeant later recalled, "You could talk to the sky. You'd call, and death came from above." Oral History Collection, 1945. But the radios were more than tools of destruction. They were lifelines. In the fog-choked forests of France, soldiers used them to call for medical evacuation, to guide lost units, and even to say final words to the rear. The engineers who built the SCR-300 never saw the front lines. Yet their inventions saved thousands who did. When the German counterattack intensified around October 15th, Hayes's company, now reinforced by a platoon of fresh troops, was ordered to hold the ridge once again while the division advanced. The difference this time was overwhelming. Every machine gun, mortar, and tank destroyer was linked through the radio net. Artillery could be adjusted within seconds. When German Stu-G3 assault guns appeared on the opposite slope, an observer relayed coordinates directly to a battery of 105 mm howitzers 3 miles away. The shells landed with terrifying accuracy, obliterating the lead vehicle and forcing the rest to retreat. Field Artillery After Action Report, 1944. Even the enemy took note. Captured diaries from German officers recorded frustration and disbelief. The Americans coordinate fire faster than we can advance. It is as if their commander sees through the fog. Dramatized composite, the invisible eye they described was nothing mystical. It was frequency modulation, translated into tactics, behind the scenes. Technicians in mobile signal corps trucks maintained this lifeline under fire. They patched antennas with spare wire, replaced shattered vacuum tubes, and retuned frequencies while shells burst around them. One operator, Private First Class Leon Kelly, wrote in his field notes, "Every time we fix a radio, someone gets to live another day." Signal Corps Diary, 1944. By late October, the Germans had been driven back beyond the Moselle River. Hill 317, once a symbol of desperation, had become a communications hub for the entire division. And though Hayes was later promoted and reassigned, his defiance became legend, a textbook example of battlefield initiative powered by information superiority. Yet the true power of that technology wasn't in its metal or wires. It was in the doctrine it birthed. The American Army had always preached independence of command, trusting small unit leaders to think for themselves. But now, with reliable radios in their hands, those leaders could act on that independence instantly. Hayes didn't just ignore a retreat order. He reinterpreted the battlefield in real time, making a decision that no distant headquarters could have understood. This was the hidden advantage, the invisible thread that bound courage to coordination and discipline to defiance. While the enemy saw chaos, the Americans operated inside a loop of rapid communication and trust. And from that loop, the seeds of modern warfare were born. But as the battle lines stabilized and winter crept in, another, deeper transformation was taking place, one that reached beyond tactics or technology. For the men who had fought on Hill 317, and for thousands like them across Europe, the real change lay not in the weapons they carried, but in what they now believed about leadership, duty, and the thin line between obedience and honor. The next chapter of this story would not be written in circuits or steel, but in the hearts of men who learned that sometimes, to save an army, you must first disobey it. When the snows of winter descended on eastern France, Hill 317 was silent again. The craters had filled with frost, the burned trees stood like blackened bones, and the bodies of men, friend and foe alike, had been buried under thin wooden crosses. Yet the hill's story rippled far beyond the mud and mist. What Captain Samuel Hayes and his men accomplished there became a model for a new kind of warfare, studied by generals, analyzed by engineers, and remembered by soldiers who learned that courage, when paired with connection, could shape the course of a campaign in the months that followed. The U.S. Army restructured its entire tactical doctrine around what the radios had made possible. Divisional command posts now relied on layered FM networks, linking infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in near real time. At the heart of this web were the men who carried those heavy, battery-powered radios on their backs through snow and shellfire, signalers who, though rarely mentioned in dispatches, held the power to summon life or death with a turn of a dial. Signal Corps Field Memo, 1945. For the Allies, this communication revolution did more than win skirmishes. It reshaped morale. Soldiers in the field no longer felt abandoned. They could hear familiar voices from headquarters, coordinate with neighboring units, or simply know that someone, somewhere, was listening. In after-action interviews, infantrymen repeatedly described the psychological comfort of that faint, crackling voice on the other end of the line. One corporal said, "It wasn't just radio chatter, it was proof we weren't alone." Infantry Oral Record, 1945. The German army, meanwhile, began to feel the reverse. Their reports grew increasingly desperate as the Allied advance accelerated through France. The precision of American artillery, the uncanny timing of flanking maneuvers, and the unbreakable cohesion of scattered units created an illusion of omniscience. German analysts called it Kampfkoordination durch Unsichtbarkeit, battle coordination through invisibility. They were witnessing the early form of networked warfare, a strategy the world would later call C3I, command, control, communications, and intelligence. Wehrmacht Intelligence Summary, 1945. Captain Hayes's stand, once dismissed as reckless defiance, became a case study circulated among senior officers. His refusal to retreat had preserved a critical corridor, allowed the 36th Division to regroup, and prevented what could have been a catastrophic encirclement. But beyond tactics, his decision forced a reevaluation of what modern command meant. The lesson was stark. In an age of instant communication, initiative on the ground could outpace orders from above. U.S. Army Training Circular, January 1945. This realization spread quickly through the ranks. Commanders encouraged mission-type orders, a concept borrowed from the Germans' own Auftragstactik, but now empowered by superior communication. Leaders were told to define objectives, not methods. Soldiers like Hayes became the embodiment of this doctrine, a bridge between the iron discipline of the old army and the flexible, networked force of the future. Behind the front, engineers continued to refine the hardware that had made it all possible. By war's end, over 130,000 SCR, 300 sets had been produced. Motorola's assembly lines in Chicago and Fort Wayne worked without pause, often overseen by women who traced delicate solder joints by lamplight. Logistics officers devised field repair kits that allowed radios to be fixed with improvised parts, tin foil, wire scraps, and melted solder from cartridge casings. Every signal transmitted from the front carried the unseen fingerprints of these workers. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the power of connected warfare reached its zenith. Entire divisions coordinated movements over hundreds of miles without a single written order. In the final weeks before Germany's surrender, General Eisenhower himself remarked in a staff briefing, "We are fighting not as divisions, but as one living system." Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Record, 1945. After the war, the legacy of that system endured. The lessons from Hill 317 and the broader European campaign shaped the emerging doctrine of the Cold War. The Korean conflict would see radio networks expanded to link air strikes and ground operations in mountainous terrain. Vietnam would evolve the concept further, with helicopter-borne units directed by portable transceivers derived from the SCR-300's design. By the 1990s, the idea had matured into something unrecognizable yet rooted in the same soil: the digital battlefield, GPS. Encrypted data and satellite communication descended directly from those clumsy, humming FM sets carried by exhausted infantrymen through the mud of France. But technology alone didn't carry the legacy. It was the spirit behind it, the belief that even in the chaos of war, clarity of connection could bind men to a common purpose. That was what Hayes represented, not rebellion, but trust in his own judgment, forged through the ability to see the battlefield when others were blind. In a post-war interview conducted by the Army War College, one of Hayes's surviving sergeants described him simply: "He didn't talk about orders. He talked about what was right in front of us. And he knew it better than anyone because his radio told him the truth." Veterans Interview Transcript, 1946. The psychological impact of such leadership rippled outward. Soldiers who fought under commanders like Hayes tended to report higher morale, greater unit cohesion, and lower desertion rates. Psychologists studying post-war veterans found that the sense of agency, the ability to act, not merely obey, was one of the strongest predictors of emotional recovery after combat. U.S. Army Psychiatric Assessment, 1946. Meanwhile, captured German officers, interrogated after the surrender, expressed astonishment at the Americans' refusal to fragment under pressure. "Your army fought like water," one colonel said. "When we struck, it flowed around us, and when we withdrew, it filled the space again." Dramatized composite. It was the perfect metaphor for a force unified by invisible currents of information. As for Hayes, he never sought fame. His actions were buried in divisional reports, overshadowed by larger battles. After the war, he returned to Ohio, took a job as a mechanical engineer, and rarely spoke of Hill 317. But his name appeared quietly in a 1947 training manual, an anonymous Captain H, cited in a case study titled "Decentralized Command in Mobile Warfare." Army Training Memo, 1947. In the decades that followed, the Army's evolving command systems, field radios, digital links, satellite networks, all carried the DNA of that hilltop stand. From Desert Storm to modern drone warfare, every soldier who coordinates by headset or uplink is, in some small way, walking in Hayes's footsteps. And yet, beyond the circuitry and doctrine, the story endures for another reason. It reminds us that every technological leap in warfare carries a human cost. Men who risked their lives holding a hill not for glory, but for a belief that connection could overcome chaos. Near the end of his life, when asked why he had refused to retreat that morning in October 1944, Hayes gave a simple answer. "Because the line wasn't broken," he said. "It was just quiet." Dramatized quote. In that quiet, the static hum of a battered radio, the whisper of wind through shell-torn trees, lies the eternal truth of modern war. Victory does not belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who listen the clearest.